Imagine your brain is basically a piece of hardware that physically rewires itself every single time you win a game or get a promotion or even just stand in a confident pose.
Right, it's like a biological upgrade.
Exactly. But here is the catch. That exact same upgrade that makes you successful contains this hidden neurological trap, and it could slowly destroy your ability to empathize with other human beings.
It really is the ultimate double-edged sword, you know? The biology that elevates us actually contains the very mechanisms that, left completely unchecked, isolate us entirely from the people around us.
Yeah, so if you've been looking at the stack of research you sent us and wondering, like, why your highly competent boss suddenly became so erratic after their promotion.
Or why stepping into a leadership role yourself feels so fundamentally destabilizing.
Right. This is the biological answer. So welcome to this deep dive. Today's mission is to decode the psychological and neurochemical life cycle of success.
And we have some incredible sources to pull from today.
We really do. We are going to tear into neuroscientific research on the winner effect by Ian Robertson, behavioral psychology from Dacher Keltner's book, The Power Paradox, and medical analyses of hubris syndrome by Lord David Owen.
It's a massive stack of data.
It is. The goal for you listening is to understand how winning physically alters your neurochemistry. Like why the traits that help you gain influence are literally the first things you lose when you get it.
And, crucially, how to protect yourself from the toxic side effects of your own achievements.
Exactly. Whether you are stepping into a new management role or just trying to be a more grounded leader, this deep dive will completely reframe how you view power. So where do we start?
Well, to understand the end-stage pathology of power, we actually have to start at the very beginning of this cycle.
Before you get the corner office.
Right. Before anyone can experience the neurochemical rewards of winning, they have to actually secure that first win. And the data suggests that the capacity to win isn't determined by raw intelligence at all.
Wait, really? What is it determined by?
It's determined by the physical way the brain processes failure.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's unpack the Columbia University studies by Mangels and Dweck then. Because this gets straight to that prerequisite for success.
Yeah, this study's fascinating. They brought students into a lab, hooked them up to EEG caps to measure their brain waves, and essentially forced them to fail.
Which sounds incredibly stressful.
It is. And they divided these students into two distinct camps based on a psychological baseline, which is their underlying belief about the nature of intelligence.
Right, so the first camp operates on what they call an entity theory of intelligence.
Exactly. They view cognitive ability as a fixed, immutable trait. Like you are dealt a certain genetic hand of intelligence at birth, and that is just the entirety of your capacity.
The kind of biological fatalism. You either have it or you don't.
Yeah, precisely. The second camp operates on an incremental theory. They view intelligence not as a fixed vessel, but as a muscle.
Something that can be expanded and strengthened.
Right, through effort, learning, and specifically through the friction of making mistakes.
Okay, so the fascinating part is what the EEG caps actually revealed. Because this isn't just, a difference in attitude or having a positive thinking mantra.
No, it's hardwired. When the researchers gave these students difficult questions and then explicitly told them they got the answer wrong, their brains fired in completely different electrical patterns.
Let's look at the neural data there, because the divergence is striking. For the students holding the entity theory, the fixed mindset, the moment that negative feedback registered, what happened?
Their brains generated a massive spike in a specific electrical pattern called a P3A wave.
I want to break down that P3A wave because the source material gets very technical here. In the context of this study, what does that spike actually represent in the hardware of the brain?
So the P3A wave is an electrophysiological marker that typically originates in the anterior cingulate cortex. It is essentially the brain's alarm bell for a confounding, sudden threat.
An alarm bell. So when these fixed mindset students failed a question, their brains didn't process it as just missing a trivia fact.
No, not at all. Because they believe their intelligence is a permanent, static trait, failing a test is perceived by the brain as a direct, existential threat to the ego.
Wow.
Yeah, the P3A wave is the physical manifestation of the brain saying, I am fundamentally inadequate, my status is threatened, and I cannot change this.
They perceive failure as a catastrophic revelation of their permanent limits. So the brain just goes into a defensive crouch.
Exactly. But the incremental theorists, the ones who think intelligence is a muscle, their EEG readings looked entirely different when they were told they failed.
They didn't have that P3A spike.
They did not produce that massive P3A ego threat wave. The threat detection centers remained relatively quiet.
So what was happening instead?
Instead, when they failed and were subsequently offered the correct answer, their brains showed dense surges of electrical activity in areas linked to semantic processing and memory encoding.
They were actively grabbing the new information.
Right, their brains were biologically open to learning. Because failure isn't a threat to their identity, it is processed merely as incoming data.
It is a prompt to adjust the algorithm.
Exactly.
So to even get on the ladder of success, you have to possess a brain that treats failure as actionable data rather than a personal attack.
Yeah, because if your neural pathways shut down in self-defense every single time you encounter a setback, you will never accumulate the critical mass of wins necessary to trigger the biological cascades we are going to look at next.
And that underlying resilience is the trigger mechanism for what Ian Robertson calls the winner effect.
Yes, and to truly see the raw mechanics of this effect, we actually have to strip away the complexities of human society and look at the animal kingdom.
The example in Robertson's work that completely reframes this concept involves the African cichlid fish.
It is such a profound demonstration of biological plasticity. So in a cichlid fish community, the social hierarchy is absolute. The environment is rigidly divided between the T male, the dominant territorial male, and the NT males, the non-territorial subordinates.
And the physical difference between them is stark, right? Like the T-male is massive, brightly colored, highly aggressive, and controls the breeding grounds.
Right, and the NT males are small, pale, colorless. They basically spend their lives hiding in the shadows to avoid being attacked.
The sources mention they look so vastly different that observers often mistake the NT males for a completely different species or for females.
Yeah, the biology perfectly mirrors the social status, but the crucial experiment occurs when you disrupt that hierarchy.
What happens?
If the dominant T-male is removed from the tank, a power vacuum suddenly exists. The most motivated NT male lurking in the shadows will perceive this shift in the social dynamic.
And then what?
Within 24 hours, that pale, submissive fish undergoes a violent metamorphosis.
I have to pause on the timeline there, because biological adaptation is usually a really slow evolutionary process. Transforming from a small, pale subordinate into a massive, colorful alpha in 24 hours sounds biologically impossible.
It does sound crazy.
How does the central nervous system signal the endocrine system to rebuild a body that fast?
Well, it happens so quickly because the genetic blueprints for dominance are already present in the subordinate fish. They are just heavily suppressed by the environment. The moment the fish perceives the power vacuum, its hypothalamus triggers the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. This acts as a chemical key that unlocks dormant epigenetic expressions.
So the DNA itself doesn't change, but which parts of the DNA are actively being read and executed changes completely.
That is exactly the mechanism. The environmental cue of an open territory triggers a massive hormonal cascade. The fish's colors become vibrant, its muscle mass increases, its aggressive behavior switch on, and its reproductive system fully activates.
It is a biological transformation dictated entirely by the acquisition of status and territory.
Exactly.
The environment acts as a switch that fundamentally alters the organism. But does this mean that once you achieve a win, your biology is permanently altered to keep winning?
That is the big question.
The sources detail some studies with rodents by biologists Oig, Beal, and Marler that isolate this exact variable.
Right. Oig, Beal, and Marler designed an experiment to test if the mere act of winning, isolated from physical size or baseline skill, could actually change future outcomes.
How do they test that?
They staged fights between male mice, but they artificially manipulated the odds. They took a subject mouse and placed it in an enclosure with a smaller, mildly sedated opponent.
A completely rigged fight. The subject mouse is guaranteed to win.
Exactly. They allowed the subject mice to accumulate 1, 2, or 3 of these effortless rigged victories.
And then?
Following this conditioning phase, they took those winning mice and placed them in an enclosure against much larger, highly aggressive, non-sedated mice that, under normal circumstances, would easily dominate them.
And the results showed that the mice with the rigged wins were significantly more likely to defeat the larger, tougher opponent.
Yes.
But surely that isn't just because they learned new fighting techniques against a sedated opponent.
No, it has absolutely nothing to do with learning technique. The prior winds physically reshaped the animal's neurochemistry, giving it a baseline biological advantage it did not possess before.
What shifted chemically?
The act of winning triggered a surge of testosterone. This hormonal shift made the mouse faster, more aggressive, less sensitive to pain, and drastically lowered its anxiety levels.
Let's translate this to human neurochemistry.
Yeah.
Because we aren't freeze fighting for a rock, and we aren't mice in a cage.
Right, thankfully.
But Robertson argues that this identical neurochemical engine is idling inside of us. So how does the human version of the winner effect actually operate?
In humans, it centers on a specific feedback loop between hormones and neurotransmitters, primarily testosterone and dopamine.
Okay.
When a human experiences a victory, closing a massive acquisition, winning an election, or simply mastering a complex task, the body releases a surge of testosterone.
And we usually view testosterone just as the aggression hormone.
We do, but in the context of the winner effect, it actually functions as the hormone of confidence and threat reduction.
It dampens the brain's fear response.
Yes, it acts as an anxiolytic. It travels across the blood-brain barrier and stimulates the release of dopamine within the striatum, which is a region deep inside the brain's reward circuitry.
And dopamine is not just about pleasure, right?
Right. It is the neurotransmitter of motivation, focus, and reward seeking. It creates what neuroscientists call motivational salience.
Meaning it stamps the behavior into your neural pathways. It tells the brain, whatever sequence of actions we just performed to get this feeling, that was highly optimal. We need to repeat that sequence.
Exactly. It sharpens your cognitive focus on the goal and increases your appetite for taking the risks necessary to achieve it again.
That makes sense.
But the most profound aspect of the winner effect is that it is not merely a transient chemical rush. Repeated winning actually induces structural changes in the brain.
Structural changes, like physical changes.
Yes. The surges of testosterone actually increase the density of androgen receptors in the reward networks.
You know, receptors are the docking stations that the testosterone binds to.
Yeah. So by physically building more of these receptors, your brain becomes a highly sensitized sponge. It becomes hyper-responsive to future testosterone.
It sounds like, if we think of the brain as a computer, it sounds like winning doesn't just give you a temporary software update. It physically installs more RAM and a better processor in your brain's hardware, turning it into a turbocharged car.
The hardware analogy is incredibly apt. You get more neurochemical output for the exact same amount of environmental input.
You are engineering a brain that is literally primed to win again.
Exactly.
That biological compounding interest is empowering, but it raises a massive logistical question for you as a listener. If the act of winning gives us this massive biological advantage, how do we secure that very first win in a complex human society?
Right, because we don't acquire status by physically biting our coworkers.
Hopefully not. How do we actually gain the power that triggers this biological upgrade? That brings us to the surprisingly cooperative nature of human power. From our second source, Dacher Keltner's The Power Paradox.
Yeah, Keltner's work requires us to dismantle a centuries-old paradigm. Our modern understanding of power has been overwhelmingly shaped by the philosophy of Niccolo Machiavelli.
Machiavellian power.
Right. The Machiavellian framework suggests that power is a zero-sum game seized through force, coercion, strategic deception, and the installation of fear.
It is the archetype of the ruthless autocrat, or the cutthroat corporate executive, who climbs the ladder by stepping on the necks of their peers.
It's the belief that being feared is the ultimate, most stable form of influence.
But Keltner disagrees.
Entirely. Keltner's data, drawn from decades of behavioral science spanning hunter-gatherer societies, corporate boardrooms, and university dormitories, demonstrates that the Machiavellian view is fundamentally flawed when applied to the daily operation of human social networks.
So what is his definition?
He proposes a much more accurate, evidence-based definition. Power is simply the capacity to make a difference in the world by influencing others.
And the central thesis of his research is that in functioning groups, power is not grabbed by force, it is granted by the collective.
That is the pivotal shift in understanding. In complex human networks, power is a resource granted by the group to individuals who reliably advance the greater good of that specific collective.
So human groups possess an evolved, instinctive mechanism to elevate the status of people who facilitate smooth functioning and group survival.
Yes, absolutely. Keltner isolates 5 specific social tendencies that consistently compel a group to grant someone power: enthusiasm, kindness, focus, calmness, and openness.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a list of traits for a kindergarten teacher, not a CEO.
I know, it really does.
Let's dig into the evolutionary psychology of why a group elevates these specific traits. Why, for instance, is calmness a trigger for granting power?
Well, to understand that, we have to look at the contagion of stress in social species. When a group faces a crisis, a predator in the ancestral environment, or a collapsing supply chain in a modern corporation, the collective anxiety spikes.
Cortisol levels rise across the group.
Exactly, which impairs collective decision-making. An individual who exhibits true calmness acts as a biological anchor. By maintaining a regulated nervous system, they signal competence and reduce the ambient stress of the group.
The group naturally grants them influence because their presence makes the group functionally smarter and more cohesive under pressure.
Yes.
Focus operates similarly, right? In an environment of infinite distractions, someone who can maintain the group's attention on a singular solvable path forward is incredibly valuable.
Right.
And kindness isn't about being universally liked. It's about demonstrating that you consider the welfare of the network, which builds the trust required for people to execute your plans.
When an individual consistently displays these behaviors, the group rewards them with status, resources, and influence.
But networks are constantly shifting. How does a group continuously evaluate who deserves power?
The sources emphasize the role of reputation and gossip, which Keltner argues we fundamentally misunderstand.
We usually view gossip as a trivial or purely destructive behavior.
We do, but from a sociological and evolutionary perspective, gossip is a highly sophisticated mechanism for social regulation. A person's status is essentially the aggregate positivity of their reputation.
And reputation is the ledger the group uses to track an individual's behavior over time.
Exactly. Gossip is the group's immune system.
It is the primary way the immune system communicates.
Yeah. If an individual begins to behave in a Machiavellian manner, if they hoard resources, take credit for others' work, or treat subordinates with contempt, the group uses gossip to rapidly distribute that data across the network.
And what does that shared information lead to?
Collective shaming and ultimately ostracism. The group collectively withdraws their cooperation, effectively stripping the coercive individual of their influence because that individual has become a localized threat to the network's efficiency.
Wait, I have to offer a pushback here based on historical realities.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because if power is given to the kind, the focused, and the empathetic, how do we explain the brutal dictators of history who clearly grabbed power by force? How do we explain the tyrants who maintained it through sheer terror?
It is the essential counterargument, and Keltner's research does not deny the existence or devastating impact of coercive power. The distinction lies in the difference between how influence is sustained in daily, functioning human networks versus what occurs when an entire systemic structure is hijacked.
Ah, so taking over a broken system.
Yes, coercive power influence maintained through a military junta or an absolute economic monopoly almost always occurs when an individual takes over institutions that are already failing or unstable.
They exploit a vulnerability in the macro structure.
Right. But Keltner's point is that within the microstructures of daily life, the teams, the departments, the communities where we spend our time enduring influence relies on mutual empowerment.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, even the most ruthless dictator initially required a core cadre of loyal followers who willingly granted them power, supported their initial rise, and executed their orders. Sustainable, enduring influence fundamentally relies on mutual empowerment.
So we gain power by focusing on others, and this success triggers the biological winner effect. The massive surges of testosterone and dopamine make us razor-sharp and confident. We reach the peak of the success cycle.
And here is where the system turns on us.
What happens when the brain gets chronically flooded with this cocktail of success? This brings us to the core of Keltner's power paradox and the neurological death of empathy.
Yeah, the power paradox is perhaps the most tragic irony of human neurobiology. The paradox dictates that the psychological and neurological experience of holding power actively degrades the very skills that led to its acquisition in the first place.
So the empathy, the giving, the gratitude, the exact virtues that cause the group to elevate you are systematically dismantled by the biological reality of being in charge.
Getting power destroys your biological capacity to wield it gracefully.
There is a classic psychological experiment detailed in the sources that perfectly illustrates this sudden loss of perspective. It's known as the E experiment. Let's talk about that.
The E experiment elegantly demonstrates how the feeling of power induces a kind of spatial and psychological blindness. Researchers brought participants into a lab and asked them to complete a seemingly simple task: draw the capital letter E on their own foreheads using a marker.
It sounds like a parlor trick, but the setup is brilliant.
It is. Before they handed over the marker, the researchers primed the participants, subtly manipulating their internal feelings of status.
How did they do that?
One group was asked to write a detailed essay recalling a time when they possessed immense power and control over other individuals. The other group wrote an essay recalling a time when they felt entirely powerless, subjugated, and dependent on the whims of someone else.
So you are artificially inducing a high-power cognitive state and a low-power cognitive state.
Exactly. And then comes the marker. When drawing an E on your own forehead, you have two spatial choices. You can draw it so that it is legible from your own internal perspective, which means the letter will appear backward to anyone looking at you.
Right.
Or you can endure the slight cognitive load of reversing the letter in your mind, drawing it backward to yourself so that it is perfectly legible to an outside observer.
It's a literal test of perspective taking.
The results were highly consistent. The participants, primed with feelings of high power, were nearly 3 times more likely to draw the E backward to the observer.
They drew it entirely from their own self-centered orientation.
Yes. While the low-power group, hyper-aware of their environment and the people around them, almost universally drew it so the observer could read it, the feeling of power significantly and immediately diminishes your cognitive capacity to adopt another person's visual and psychological vantage point.
It literally traps you inside your own head. But the research goes far deeper than psychological priming. We are talking about physical, measurable deficits in the brain's hardware. The sources detail some chilling studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, conducted by neuroscientists Jeremy Hoogeveen and Sukhvinder Obihi. Let's dive deep into the neurobiology of this empathy loss.
This research pulls the power paradox out of the realm of behavioral psychology and grounds it in hard neurobiology. Hoogeveen and Obi wanted to investigate the brain's mirror neuron system.
Which is what exactly?
Humans possess a specialized neural network that allows us to physically mirror the internal states of others. If I watch you accidentally hit your thumb with a hammer, my mirror system activates, and my own pain centers register a shadow of your agony.
It is the biological infrastructure of empathy.
Right, known clinically as motor resonance. It's the reason we flinch when we see someone else get hurt, or yawn when they yawn. Our brains are simulating their physical reality.
So how do they test this with TMS? I want to make sure we understand the mechanics of the machinery here.
TMS involves placing a magnetic coil over a specific area of the subject's scalp, in this case, the motor cortex. The coil delivers a brief, concentrated magnetic pulse that passes through the skull and stimulates the neurons beneath it.
Okay.
If you stimulate the area of the motor cortex that controls the hand, the subject's thumb will involuntarily twitch. By measuring the electrical strength of that twitch in the muscle, you can precisely quantify how excitable or active that motor pathway is at that exact moment.
So it's a direct readout of the brain's motor readiness.
Exactly. In the study, they once again primed participants into high-power or low-power states. Then they had them watch a simple video of a hand squeezing a rubber ball.
And under normal circumstances.
Under normal circumstances, watching this action triggers the mirror neuron system. The observer's brain simulates the squeezing action, their motor cortex becomes highly excitable, and the TMS pulse will result in a much larger thumb twitch. The brain is resonating with the video.
And what happened to the high-powered individuals?
In the participants primed with high power, the mirror system was functionally suppressed. The TMS pulses revealed that their motor resonance was significantly dampened compared to the low-power individuals. Their motor cortex simply did not react to the actions of the person on the screen.
Their brains biologically failed to resonate.
The hardware disconnected, and the most disturbing finding of the study was this. Even when the researchers explicitly instructed the high-power individuals to consciously try and empathize, to actively focus on connecting with the person in the video, their motor resonance remained flat.
That is terrifying.
It really is.
It's as if achieving power forces your brain to put on emotional noise-canceling headphones. You literally lose the biological frequency required to hear other people's experiences. You can intellectually understand they are stressed, but you can't feel it.
That analogy captures the neurological isolation perfectly. And to understand why the brain willingly puts on those noise-canceling headphones, we have to look at the interplay of two fundamental neural circuits: the behavioral activation system, or BAS, and the behavioral inhibition system, the BIS.
Let's define the parameters of the BAS and the BIS.
The behavioral activation system is your brain's accelerator pedal. It is heavily driven by dopamine. It is the system that promotes action, goal-seeking, impulsivity, and the aggressive pursuit of rewards.
And the BIS.
The behavioral inhibition system is your brain's braking mechanism. It is driven by threat detection, anxiety, and social caution. It is the voice that tells you to stop, scan the environment, and calculate the social risks before you act.
So how does the acquisition of power alter the balance between the accelerator and the brakes?
Power violently skews the balance because the leader is constantly flooded with the dopamine generated by the winner effect. The BAS, the accelerator, is hyperactivated. They become impulsively driven by massive rewards.
While
While simultaneously, the reality of holding power actively suppresses the BIS. Because the leader is positioned at the top of the hierarchy, their brain calculates that they are safe from social threats. They don't need to worry about being fired or ostracized. Therefore, the brain cuts the brake lines.
it shuts down the threat detection system because it thinks the war is already won.
Right.
It leads to risk blindness and a lack of social caution.
Exactly. The leader loses their sensitivity to risk and their awareness of the subtle warning signs that subordinates might be trying to signal to them.
So when a leader's brain shuts off its empathy and inhibition systems while being flooded with the addictive drug of dopamine, they cross the line from standard bad management into a recognizable medical pathology.
And they absolutely do.
Which brings us to hubris syndrome and the toxic triangle. Let's introduce Lord David Owen and Jonathan Davidson's research.
Lord David Owen brings a fascinating perspective. He is a trained medical doctor, a neurologist, and psychiatrist, but he also served as the UK Foreign Secretary. So he spent years inside the rooms where global power is wielded.
He observed these leaders up close.
Yes. He and Davidson analyzed the medical and historical records of world leaders over a century. They identified a distinct pattern of aberrant, destructive behavior that they formally proposed classifying as hubris syndrome.
It is vital to point out that hubris syndrome is not a chronic personality disorder like narcissistic personality disorder. What is the fundamental difference?
The distinction is crucial. Narcissistic personality disorder is generally understood as a chronic, lifelong psychological condition rooted in early development. Hubris syndrome, conversely, is an acquired situational disorder.
It is an occupational hazard.
Right. It is triggered specifically by the environmental condition of holding substantial power for an extended duration, particularly when that power is unconstrained by strong checks and balances. The syndrome develops while in office, and notably, the symptoms often abate or disappear entirely once the individual loses their grip on power.
Okay, so it is an illness caused by the corner office. Owen and Davidson outlined 14 specific clinical symptoms of hubris syndrome. While some overlap with cluster B disorders, 5 are completely unique to the experience of unchecked power.
Let's look at the specific behaviors. One of the most immediate observable symptoms is a shift in language toward a messianic manner of speaking.
Right.
The leader ceases to talk about their policies or actions in practical terms. Instead, they frame their decisions as if they are ordained by a higher calling or historical destiny.
This often manifests in their pronouns, right? Using the royal we.
Yes, the linguistic markers are a primary diagnostic tool. They begin using the royal we or talking about themselves in the third person. This linguistic shift reflects another core symptom, the complete conflation of the self with the organization or the nation.
They no longer see a boundary between their personal ego and the entity they lead.
Exactly. They internalize the belief that their personal instincts and interests are entirely identical to the interests of the country or the corporation.
Which means any criticism of their decisions is immediately interpreted as a treasonous attack.
Because if you believe you are the state, then disagreeing with you is a crime against the state. Which leads to another fascinating symptom, feeling accountable only to God or history.
They reject standard accountability.
They develop an unwavering belief that they are no longer accountable to the mundane courts of colleagues, boards of directors, or the press.
But the symptom that I found most compelling is what they term hubristic incompetence. Because the assumption is that people who reach these heights of power are highly competent individuals.
They almost always were highly competent during their ascent. But hubris syndrome systematically degrades that competence.
How so?
The leader becomes so utterly consumed by the grandeur of their broad vision that they completely ignore the practical nuts and bolts of executing the policy. They come to view the details as tedious and beneath them.
And because their brake pedal, the behavioral inhibition system, has been suppressed, they are literally incapable of foreseeing the catastrophic risks of ignoring those details. To ground this clinical theory, the source material provides several impartial historical and political case studies. And I want to emphasize to the listener that we are looking at this purely through the lens of Lord Owen's medical and historical data. We are absolutely not taking political sides here.
Right. The study is a rigorous, objective analysis. Owen and Davidson identified several leaders across the political spectrum who, they argue, developed profound hubris syndrome. They point to UK prime ministers like David Lloyd George, Margaret Thatcher, and Tony Blair, and US presidents such as Richard Nixon and George W. Bush.
And the way they quantified this was through deep linguistic analysis of their public speeches over time.
The linguistic data provides a map of their neurochemical decline. Researchers ran transcripts through text analysis software. They mapped two specific trends: the decline in cognitive complexity and the increase in absolute certainty.
What does that look like in the speeches?
Early in a leader's tenure, their speech patterns are marked by nuance. They use words like however, although, perhaps. But as hubris syndrome takes hold, those markers plummet. They're replaced by words of absolute certainty, always, never, must.
Their sentence structures become shorter and more rigid.
Exactly.
The sources detail how Richard Nixon's mental state severely deteriorated after his massive landslide re-election in 1972. The massive dopamine hit of absolute political victory suppressed his inhibition systems.
It led directly to the arrogant, risk-blind decision-making and isolation of the Watergate cover-up.
The sources also pivot to the medical secrecy of leaders, using JFK as a prime example of how a leader's neurochemistry dictates global policy. Let's talk about the Bay of Pigs versus the Cuban Missile Crisis.
This is a terrifying illustration. Early in his presidency, Kennedy authorized the Bay of Pigs invasion, a logistical disaster characterized by extreme impulsivity and poor planning.
And the historical record shows his medical care was highly dangerous at that time.
He was being treated by Dr. Max Jacobson, known as Dr. Feelgood. Jacobson was regularly injecting the president with a reckless cocktail of highly potent amphetamines and steroids.
And amphetamines massively hyperactivate the dopamine-driven BAS, the accelerator.
Right. The amphetamines exacerbate impulsivity and degrade careful analysis. The Bay of Pigs was launched by a brain that was chemically compromised.
Contrast that with the successful Cuban Missile Crisis under strict physical therapy.
A year and a half later, Dr. Hans Kraus took over, reduced the amphetamines, and implemented a strict physical therapy regimen. He stabilized the president's neurochemistry.
And the behavioral result was profound.
During the missile crisis, Kennedy's brain was no longer hijacked. He engaged his inhibition systems, slowed the process down, engaged in complex perceptive taking, and found a diplomatic compromise.
It's amazing that global history hinged on one man's dopamine levels. But business hubris and paranoia are just as destructive. The sources apply this to the corporate world using Enron and WorldCom.
Enron was described as a millionaire factory. It was an environment precision-engineered to manufacture hubris syndrome. They utilized a rank and yank system that created a gladiator-style atmosphere.
Unmitigated power, testosterone, and groupthink blinded leaders to everything except the share price.
Their behavioral inhibition systems were completely deactivated. They were blind to the actual mechanics of their business and dismissive of the illegality of their actions.
And if that hubris remains unchecked, we see the descent into tyranny. Explain the evolutionary root of paranoia and how it becomes hypersensitized in isolated leaders.
Paranoia is a survival mechanism to detect social threats, but an isolated leader with hubris syndrome has driven away anyone who challenges them. Subconsciously, the leader's brain knows it is isolated from the truth.
So the threat detection system goes into overdrive.
It becomes hypersensitized, scanning frantically for threats. They perceive ambiguous signals as deliberate conspiracies. This paranoid distortion creates the toxic triangle.
Let's define the toxic triangle.
It requires three elements: destructive leaders, susceptible followers, and conducive environments.
Destructive leaders fueled by narcissism and paranoia. Susceptible followers who are either terrified conformers or ambitious colluders, and a conducive environment of societal instability.
When those three align, you get historical tyrants like Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and Pol Pot. Despite differing ideologies, they all share the exact same biological pathology at the top: consuming paranoia, demands for submission, and dehumanization of opponents.
Which brings up a vital question. If the biology of power is this intoxicating, similar to cocaine, is there such a thing as a benevolent dictator? Or is the human brain simply incapable of handling absolute power without getting sick?
Based on the neurobiological and historical evidence, a long-term benevolent dictator is a myth. The human nervous system is simply not wired to process unchecked absolute power without undergoing structural changes that degrade empathy and promote hubris. The hardware corrupts.
We've seen the devastating effects of too much power. But the opposite end of the spectrum is just as biologically profound. What does a lack of power do to the human body?
If power is an intoxicating stimulant, powerlessness functions as a slow-acting systemic poison. It centers around the physical toll of chronic stress, specifically cortisol.
Cortisol is the body's primary alarm system,
Yeah.
designed for acute survival.
Right. It prepares the body for fight or flight. It shuts down non-essential systems like immune response and complex thought. In short bursts, it saves your life.
But when you lack control, when you are powerless, you enter a perpetual state of chronic stress. Your body constantly drips cortisol into your bloodstream.
And the neurological damage is severe. Chronic cortisol literally shrinks the physical volume of the hippocampus, your memory center.
It damages your ability to form memories.
And it deeply impairs the prefrontal cortex, which handles executive function, planning, and problem solving.
So being powerless physically damages the brain's architecture, making you less capable of escaping that environment. Why are modern humans so vulnerable to this? The sources talk about the fragile self.
Modern humans lack a stable group mind. For millennia, we lived in interdependent hunter-gatherer bands with secure roles. Now, we navigate shifting hierarchies and constantly audition for our status.
So our fragile self-esteem is threatened.
When we are at the bottom, we experience severe social evaluative stress. The brain equates social irrelevance with death, flooding the body with cortisol.
Introduce Geert-Hofstede's power distance index here.
It measures how unequally power is distributed in an organization. In a steep hierarchy with a high index, subordinates have zero autonomy. They develop learned helplessness.
Which is the death of agency. They become paralyzed. The sources use the Chernobyl disaster as an example of the fatal consequences of this.
Chernobyl is the ultimate tragedy of power dynamics. You had the deputy chief engineer, Dyatlov, embodying hubris syndrome, pushing ahead with a dangerous test. And the subordinate engineers beneath him could see the reactor failing.
But they didn't stop it because of the extreme power distance.
They were so testosterone depleted, stressed, and intimidated that they were paralyzed by social evaluative threat. The fear of being screamed at overrode their rational understanding that the reactor would explode.
The powerlessness of the underlings allowed the hubris of the boss to try to melt down. Contrast that powerlessness with the ultimate biological shield: safety signals.
A safety signal tells your amygdala the threat has passed. The ultimate safety signal is supreme social recognition. The statistic here is fascinating. Oscar and Nobel Prize winners live, on average, 4 years longer than nominees.
And it isn't about the money or healthcare.
No, they controlled for that. That level of ultimate peer validation acts as a lifelong insurance policy against social threat. It drastically reduces cortisol and boosts brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF.
It literally protects your cells from aging. It sounds like we are caught in a biological trap. If we stay at the bottom, the stress of powerlessness damages our bodies. If we rise to the top, the intoxication of power damages our minds. Is there a middle ground?
Fortunately, the neuroscience provides us with the tools to hack our own biology and bypass this trap.
Let's talk about hacking the brain for better leadership. Introduce the distinction between S-power and P-power.
P-power is personal, ego-driven power. It's the drive to accumulate control solely for personal status. S-power is social altruistic power. It's the desire to acquire influence to benefit the broader community.
How does power help?
S-power acts as a biological coolant against the destructive dopamine surges of P-power. It maintains the behavioral inhibition system and keeps the mirror neurons active.
And the research shows women tend to utilize more S-power.
On average, yes, which may explain why the most notorious power-addicted tyrants in history have almost exclusively been men. This power framework prevents the toxic degradation of empathy.
What about David McClelland's research on the Goldilocks zone of goals?
To maintain the healthy benefits of the winner effect without the addiction, we must set Goldilocks targets. They must be demanding but attainable. Too easy, no dopamine. Too hard, chronic cortisol. The Goldilocks zone provides a manageable drip of dopamine.
We also have physical and systemic interventions. Discuss power posing.
Expansive posture can trick your endocrine system. Taking up physical space temporarily lowers cortisol and boosts testosterone when you lack real power.
What about on an organizational level?
You must institutionalize the breaks. Power audits to review how decisions are made. Term limits to prevent prolonged exposure to the dopamine loop. and independent toe holders.
Mentors entirely outside the company who hold up a metaphorical mirror and force the leader to engage perspective taking.
They are the designated truth tellers.
Finally, detail the Benjamin Franklin effect.
Franklin wanted to win over a rival legislator who hated him. Instead of coercing him, Franklin asked for a small favor to borrow a rare book.
And the rival agreed, which triggered cognitive dissonance.
Exactly. The rival's brain couldn't reconcile hating Franklin while doing him a favor. To resolve the dissonance, the brain subconsciously altered the attitude, deciding he must actually like Franklin. It builds cooperative influence rather than coercive power.
So if power is a high-performance sports car, power is the braking system, term limits are the guardrails, and the Benjamin Franklin effect is how you get people to happily pave the road for you.
That's a perfect summary.
Bring this full circle. We've seen how viewing intelligence as incremental sets the stage for success, how winning rewires our testosterone and dopamine pathways, the inherent risk of losing our empathy to hubris syndrome, and the protective measures we can take to maintain our humanity while wielding influence.
Right.
Remember, every interaction is an exchange of mutual influence. Your brain is actively being shaped by where you sit in the hierarchy of your workplace, your family, and your community.
It's a continuous biological feedback loop.
We spent this entire deep dive looking at how power changes the brains of leaders and followers. But consider the physical spaces you occupy every day. If expansive postures and visual cues of dominance can literally alter your neurochemistry, how is the actual architecture of your office, your home, or your city silently dictating your hormone levels and your potential for success before you even speak a word? Something to think about.